It's Wednesday, the 22nd of September 2021. Welcome to Fear and Greed, the business podcast that sets you up for a successful day. I'm Michael Thompson, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Hi, Michael.
Melbourne comes to a standstill as a result of construction workers and anti-vax protesters marching through the streets, while Sydney's builders can head back to work on Monday. That's our main story. There's plenty more around. The share market claws back some gains after Monday's absolute pummelling. The federal government pushes to vaccinate under 12s, and ANZ's boss is worried about cyber attacks on small business. Plus, stay listening for a chat about investing in overseas property. But first, to our top story, there were some pretty disturbing scenes in Melbourne yesterday. A lot of protesters, a lot of police, flares, a really ugly scene. The protests shut down part of the city from the CBD to the Westgate Freeway.
That's right, Michael. It didn't look good at all. It really all started a couple of weeks ago with the decision to only allow limited numbers of construction workers on site. Then on Monday, there was a violent protest outside the CFMEU headquarters. That's the main union, of course. The marchers claimed that the union itself didn't do enough to stop the mandating of vaccines on work sites. That had come in late last week. Now, keep in mind, there were more than 400 cases in Victoria are linked to the construction industry, so that's why that mandate came in. Then on Monday night, Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews shut down the sector. Clearly, he'd had enough. He certainly lost the support of the construction workers. And yesterday, it was a combination of construction workers and anti-vaxxers confronting the police. They closed down the city. The ACTU, which is the peak body for unions, of course, was frantically saying that it was the anti-vaxxers and far right-wing groups that hijacked the march. Certainly it wasn't a good look, and certainly there were construction workers amidst it. In contrast to all this, the New South Wales government yesterday said it was about to lift its 50% limit on construction sites in Greater Sydney. So that means if you work in construction and you're vaccinated, you can go back to work pretty much as normal from next Monday.
I suppose the question that you have to ask after this kind of thing is, have the protesters actually achieved anything?
Not that I can tell, at least publicly. Maybe the publicity is what they wanted, but given by far the majority of the population is pro-vaccination, I don't think the protests are actually going to win much public sympathy. Protest marches haven't been a thing in Australia for decades, and I just don't think anyone really wants them to re-emerge.
Why do we care so much about construction? And I don't mean that to sound so flippant. It's more about, why does the government often make different rules specifically for that sector?
In many ways, the construction sector is the most important sector in the economy. First, it's a big employer. It's actually the number 3 employer. Only healthcare and retail employ more people, and it accounts for about 9% of all workers. But what it does that the other two don't do so much is it has huge flow-on effects to the rest of the economy. So when people build a house, it's the same deal with retail or industrial space, they need to fit it out. So a house might cost $250,000, but the owners can spend half that again on landscaping, on white goods, on homewares. So the flow-on effect in the construction sector, particularly around residential housing, is enormous. That's why it often gets special consideration.
Okay, so it's a big employer, but it goes a lot further than that. Let's just hope we don't see a repeat then of yesterday today. Onto the markets now. What's happened over the last 24 hours?
It's been a much quieter 24 hours than Monday. Overnight, Wall Street traded ahead of the 2-day Federal Reserve meeting. That's scheduled to kick off later this morning Australian time, and we won't know too much about that for another 48 hours. In early afternoon trading, there's 3 key indices on Wall Street. That's the S&P 500, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, and the Nasdaq were all higher. European markets were also higher. They bounced back as well. Locally, yesterday proved to be a pretty good session. The S&P ASX 200 finished up 0.4% to 7,274 points, clawing back some of the falls from the previous day. Now, 10 of the 11 sub-indices were positive, with only the financial index falling. Energy and technology stocks did best.
Yeah, much better day. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Sean, plenty of stories around this morning. What's the latest COVID news?
Well, the news in New South Wales continues to improve. There were a little over 1,000 cases yesterday. Tragically, 10 deaths. That's where the news has been really dreadful in that state over the last week or so, the number of deaths. In other news from New South Wales, local government areas in the north of the state near the Queensland border will go into a 7-day lockdown from tonight. The state is on track to hit 70% full vaccination rate on October 9. So that would mean some reopening of the state from the 11th of October. The one thing I liked yesterday, though, Michael, in the middle of the school holidays, the New South Wales state government said they would allow 3 children to gather in a home as long as the parents of the child from that home are vaccinated. I'm really happy about that one.
Yeah, popular move, that one.
Definitely. In Victoria, there are 603 cases. In the ACT, recorded 16 new cases.
Now, I noticed on Monday night that the US Food and Drug Administration okayed the Pfizer vaccine for 5 to 11-year-olds. What's that mean for us here?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Yesterday, Health Minister Greg Hunt urged Pfizer to seek approval for its vaccine for kids as young as 5. That would follow the lead of the US FDA. Currently, you need to be 12 years or older to receive the Pfizer vaccine. But as you said, it got the okay in the US, and it would be great if it was suitable for younger children. The dosage is actually lesser than in adults, but if it is suitable, hopefully that can roll out too.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, the fallout from the big submarine announcement last week is continuing, and we'll talk about that in a second. But first, did you cringe when you watched Joe Biden forget Scott Morrison's name? I do have a little bit of sympathy for Joe Biden. I'm terrible with names. I'm terrible with faces. But then again, I'm not the US president holding a press conference with 2 other world leaders.
I still cringe when I think about it. I don't know who to feel worse for. I mean, Joe Biden for forgetting, but he must meet hundreds of people a day, or Scott Morrison for not looking too goofy. Incredible. I mean, it was a great photo opportunity for our Prime Minister, I mean, notwithstanding the gaffe, and certainly it's needed because the fallout from Australia's decision to dump France's $90 billion conventional submarine deal last week and replace it with an $80 billion nuclear sub deal with the US and UK continues to reverberate. The French are furious, and the European Union is listening to Paris. Now, the European Union and Australia are set to recommence free trade talks as from next month. These talks have been going on for 3 years, but the French European Secretary yesterday said keeping one's word was a condition of trust between democracies and allies, and he's not keen on the talks continuing.
Now, I mentioned at the top of the show, the boss of ANZ, Shane Elliott, had a bit to say about the preparedness of small businesses when it comes to cybersecurity.
He called it a massive issue, and it is. He said small and medium-sized businesses were at higher risk than ever before. In fact, he said their preparedness was woeful. Cybersecurity is one of the big issues of the next 10, 20, 30 years. Phishing is still the main concern. So about 90% of cyber attacks still occur because people open work emails that they shouldn't.
Yeah, and some of those emails are actually becoming really convincing, and they actually look quite genuine. And the other thing in this then is ransomware becoming a bigger issue. And Nine Entertainment was nearly closed down earlier in the year, and we're probably just fortunate that they were able to shift news bulletins and programs around the country and continue to operate. JBS Meats was hit, Toll Holdings also last year. It's a big issue, just keeps getting bigger. Now, the big corporate takeover this week is Canada's Brookfield Asset Management bidding $9.6 billion for energy group AusNet Services. But, bit of drama, an Australian company has made a counterbid.
It sure has. Pipeline Group, APA, it's come over the top with a $9.9 billion bid. Now, Brookfield bid $9.6 billion on Monday, and it has been granted exclusive due diligence on AusNet. So that means they get to look at the books exclusively for the next 8 weeks. But it will be impossible for the board to ignore the higher bid. Now, there's a bit of criticism around yesterday that it did grant due diligence. The board of AusNet said that they had been through a process, and it's not the first time they'd heard from APA, and they thought they had made the right decision at granting that exclusive due diligence. But there's a fair bit to play out in this one. Now, APA's share price ended down nearly 5% yesterday as a result, but AusNet Services, it was up 10% yesterday. It jumped 20% on Monday. There is nothing like price tension to push up a share price.
Now, Sean, I suspect I know what you were doing yesterday, poring over the minutes of the Reserve Bank board meeting from 2 weeks ago. Did they show us anything that we didn't know?
I'm not Stephen Koukoulas, number one. He definitely would have been poring over them. I must say, I read them and then I thought, I don't think there's anything new in that. They showed that the central bank is committed to keeping interest rates low. We sort of knew that. They also, again, reiterated that interest rates are on hold until 2024 based on the Reserve Bank's forecasts. Clearly, that's great news for anyone with a mortgage. The economy will go backwards this quarter due to lockdowns, but it will then pick up. So there wasn't a lot new there. It is interesting just how confident the central bank is about the economy returning to growth once we get through this lockdown period in the ACT, New South Wales and Victoria.
So, Sean, what's making headlines elsewhere in the media this morning?
There's a really interesting story in The Australian. According to the OECD, extra savings worth $230 billion with a B, $230 billion, will be sitting in bank accounts by the end of the year across Australia, and that will be used to fund a robust economic rebound. Now, in its economic outlook released overnight, the OECD cut its forecast for Australian growth from 5.1%, that's what it had predicted back in May, to 4% for this year. That's the biggest drop for a developed nation it's made.
Yeah, well, that seems roughly in line then with what Gareth Aird from the Commonwealth Bank told us last week about the amount of money sitting in Commonwealth Bank customers' bank accounts. About $10,000, I think, more now than before the pandemic.
Yeah, it all does seem to match up.
Yeah, now let's run through some of the other stories around today. The Roy Morgan weekly gauge of consumer sentiment rose slightly from last week, although it's still well below its long-term average. Last week, there was a drop in COVID cases in New South Wales, but there was also a fall in employment.
That's true, Michael, and the news didn't get any better for iron ore companies yesterday, with prices down again. Now, we know China wants to reduce steel output to lower carbon emissions, and yesterday there were some iron ore analysts around the place saying that the reductions would stay in place until after next year's Winter Olympics. The reason is that Beijing wants clean air at least until the Winter Olympics. So who would have thought the Winter Olympics could harm BHP?
It's not a connection that I would have made easily, so thank you for making it for me.
Welcome.
Now, Kathmandu said underlying profit more than doubled in the 12 months to July, but things are tough again under lockdowns.
I love Kathmandu. It just makes me feel young. It makes me feel I can climb mountains and walk the Inca Trail when, well, Michael, I probably can't. Anyway, I'm not going to say any more about that.
You're sounding, Sean, like the kind of person that buys a four-wheel drive to only drive in the city, or better yet, a dual cab ute when they're not a tradie.
And what's wrong with that?
No, nothing at all. Now, what's the key overseas news this morning?
Well, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has won a third term, but still is a minority government. He went to the polls hoping to win a majority, but he didn't get there. Now, Mr. Trudeau is a big spender, very keen on environmental change, so we can expect more of it. The other big global story at the moment, of course, is Evergrande. That's the Chinese property giant with $300 billion in liabilities. It's due to pay bondholders tomorrow, and it might default, which could trigger a collapse in the Chinese real estate market. That's bad not just for China, but for the global economy. And it does explain a lot of the choppiness in financial markets at the moment.
Yeah, big story, and we'll be keeping a very close eye on that one. Now, up next is the Daily Interview, and today you're talking to Chris Bedingfield from Key Global Investors about investing in real estate.
That's right, Mark, but it goes well beyond buying an apartment and putting a tenant in it. We're looking at everything from office towers to industrial buildings right around the world. We talk about retail as well as residential. Really interesting chat.
Yeah, good one. That's up next in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Michael.
It's Wednesday, the 22nd of September. Make sure you followed Fear and Greed on LinkedIn, Twitter and Facebook. And while you're online, why not leave us a review and give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you're listening. I'm Michael Thompson and that was Fear and Greed. Have a great day.